Hello and welcome to Indian Standard Time. I'm Siddharth Varadarajan and my guest today is Professor David Shambaugh, professor at George Washington University and a leading China watcher. Welcome to the show, sir. It's a great pleasure to have you.
Well, my pleasure to be here in Delhi. Thank you for the invitation.
You come to Delhi at an interesting time. There's a new man in the White House, Donald Trump, who has openly proclaimed his desire to upend various aspects of not just US domestic policy, but foreign policy, and that's primarily what concerns us during our discussion today. He has spoken about the need for the US to repair relations with Russia. He has also spoken about the need for the US to get tougher on China. As a China watcher, and as somebody who's a student of US foreign policy, how far do you think he will take his rhetoric on China as president?
Well, I'm quite concerned that he will take his rhetoric, or we should take his rhetoric as realistic. If we can judge on the first week he's been in office, many of the campaign promises that many people hoped to dismiss as campaign rhetoric have in fact been acted upon by new President Trump. He hasn't gotten around to foreign policy yet, but China is certainly on his checklist. It's rather high on his checklist, so I think we have to assume that he's going to pursue a very confrontational policy towards China, particularly in the trade realm, but probably also in the security sphere. So I think we can anticipate that, and that's going to have severe consequences, not just for the US-China relationship, but virtually every other country in the Asia-Pacific and Indo-Pacific region. Because they all straddle their relationships with Beijing and with Washington. Not a single country in Asia, seeks for U.S.-China relations to deteriorate. They want to have the benefits of both relations with both. But when the elephants fight, the grass is trampled, and there's a great fear, certainly in Southeast Asia, that they will be on the receiving end of the collateral damage. So I think we have to anticipate there's going to be a lot of volatility at a minimum. And I'm not sure Trump really understands a lot of things, but he doesn't understand China. And he doesn't understand that this is a China today that is a lot more powerful than it used to be, and they are very capable of inflicting pain and retaliating against the United States.
Were you taken aback by the call to the president of Taiwan and the suggestion by Trump that the one China policy will be reevaluated? Did that shock you?
Oh, yes, indeed. It shocked everyone. Certainly the comment about the one China policy, taking a call from the president of Taiwan was unprecedented. Although other presidents, Reagan, for example, invited the Taiwanese to send a delegation to his inauguration. Mainland China was not pleased about that. But certainly the comment about one China policy being up for renegotiation, that's shocking, and it's not going anywhere. China nor any other country is about to renegotiate the one China policy. That's the bedrock of the relationship. So he's poorly, sadly, mistaken there. And I would add that his Secretary of State designate comments about blocking China's access to its newly built islands or fortifications in the South China Sea, that's equally ill-conceived. That's an act of war. So, you really have to wonder if this new Trump administration knows what it's doing in many realms. And again, if they take some of these actions against China, there's going to be substantial pushback.
As somebody who understands the US system better than any of us in India do, tell us something about the capacity for the US establishment, as it were, or different institutional players in Washington to perhaps not counter, that may be too strong a word, but to temper some of the things he's doing. The Pentagon, for example, is well aware as an institution of the dangers that some of these statements involve. So is the State Department.
Right. Well, I think there are two or three levels to this, and you're correct to suggest that there will be continuity in policy that departments continue to carry out. The Defense Department in particular, they plan 5, 7, 8 years in advance. So I don't think we're going to see a lot of change in America's footprint, military footprint in the region, or its China policies there, or vis-a-vis India, I might add. I think India-American relations will remain quite stable under Trump. So the bureaucracies actually do have a kind of ameliorating and stabilizing effect on policies, that are out of the box, we call them in Trump. So that's one factor. Think tanks, it's striking that the Trump administration has not a single person from the kind of establishment foreign policy establishment in the think tanks in Washington. Not a single individual I know has been brought into the administration. This is really a group of people from the extreme right. This is not even the neocons, the neoconservatives that Bush had in office. This is the extreme right. These are people who've been out in the political wilderness and the intellectual wilderness forever. And they're extremely anti-intellectual, for one thing, anti-establishment. So the reservoir of expertise that's very deep in the United States, in Washington, in the think tanks, the university community, is not being tapped into. But the last point is, in fact, on February 7th, will be released a task force report on US-China policy that I've been participant in. There are 20 leading experts and former officials.
And this is a task force that was tasked by the previous...
No, it's a private sector initiative by the Asia Society. And it's going to be, we've been working for 18 months on this document. And it's a bipartisan group, but very well known. You'd recognize a lot of the names of the contributors. So this will be rolled out on February 7th. The Trump administration hopefully will take bits and pieces of it. It's a blueprint, really, for how to manage an increasingly fraught relationship with China. Last thing I'll say is that there is not much appetite in Washington for engagement with China and just continuing the relationship as it's been. There's a consensus that it has to change. The question is how and over what issues and what tactics you use.
Before I come to those elements of the menu of options that the US may have, I've been struck by some of the reportage in the last 24 to 48 hours following the executive order on immigration and refugees that Trump issued. And it emerges that the kind of interagency consultation that you would naturally expect in terms of drafting something so drastic never took place. We learned from the New York Times that even the Secretary of the DHS, Department of Homeland Security, was being briefed on this measure even as Trump was signing it. He had no input into it. How likely is it that when it comes to foreign policy, and I'm not saying that the immigration or refugee policy doesn't have foreign policy implications, it clearly does too, but it primarily or immediately impacts domestic life in the US and the lives of thousands of individuals. But how likely is it on a foreign policy issue or a defense issue that would affect US relations with a major ally or a major adversary, that you would find this kind of untrammeled executive authority unchecked or untempered by professional advice? Would you expect professionals to resign at least in protest or to make a noise about it?
Yeah, we've already seen, or as one reads, the highest level of resignations in the State Department in history of career civil servants, very high-level people that really run the machinery, run the State Department bureaucracy worldwide. Many of them have stepped down and left. Now, we've had American administrations in the past that run foreign policy out of the White House and don't discharge to the State Department or other ministries. I have in mind the Kissinger White House and the Nixon White House in particular. And there's always a kind of division of labor there. It has to be said, the Obama White House was very strong in foreign policy. Trump, I assume, will try and run foreign policy out of the White House. He's reconfiguring the National Security Council already, filling it, however, with military individuals, ex-military, retired generals. So he's not drawing again on this pool of expertise that you normally find in American government. But you cannot, in a democracy, run policy by executive order. You can do that in the first 10 days. And the American president is very circumscribed in what he's allowed to do by executive order and what he's not allowed to do. And we do have three branches of government. And if you're going to implement a foreign policy, Congress is not unimportant because it has to fund it, if nothing else.
Yeah, and ultimately, the Republican establishment at some stage, which arguably has a different measure of the way things need to play out internationally, could be a constraining factor.
That's right. If he starts withdrawing from alliances or weakening America's longstanding commitments with different countries around the world, then there's going to be substantial pushback from within the Republican Party. Now, Trump gave some reassuring words to British Prime Minister Theresa May about NATO, but he's also said some very disconcerting things about NATO and about the alliance with Japan, Australia, South Korea. So we'll have to wait and see, but there's going to be substantial pushback. He can anticipate both at home and abroad. Again, my sense of U.S.-Indian relations is there will be substantial continuity, however. That's a relationship that, first of all, he does business in India, he has familiarity with India, has good feelings about India, and the U.S.-Indian relationship has come a very long way over the last 3 administrations. It's on good, solid footing now.
I think as far as the bilateral assessment is concerned, I haven't come across anybody in government or any analyst in India who is seriously worried about a deterioration or a change in U.S.-India relations following Trump. What concerns people here is the issue that you flagged, which is the triangular relationship of Washington, Beijing, Delhi, and similar triangles across the Asia-Pacific region. And I want to get back to something that you said a few minutes ago, that even before Trump came, there was an emerging consensus in Washington that you can't really have business as usual with China, something needs to change. If you take a long view over the past 20 years, successive administrations have swung between engagement because of the importance of trade to, not containing or containment, but certainly the idea of trying to, what was the phrase they used in the Bush administration? Or to sort of make sure China plays a role as a responsible stakeholder and so on. Yeah, but essentially there was this complex strategy, and even in the Obama administration in his first year, there was all this heady talk of G2. By the end of it, you had a pivot, but even the pivot wasn't really being followed through in a way that you would imagine. What is it that explains the sense that you have and you say your colleagues have that you can't, that something new is needed? Trump may not be the ideal, but you do feel that a departure from what happened in the past was needed. What's producing this? Is it the nature of President Xi? Is it the changing nature of Chinese power in the region?
Well, U.S.-China relations is the most complicated in the world. There are many different levels to it, and some dimensions of it are going well in the educational sphere, science and technology exchanges, and a huge amount of trade and investment and tourism and the people-to-people exchanges. So we have to recognize that engagement has produced its benefits, but has been a rising level of frustration in the United States with China over a whole variety of issues, beginning with the economic domain. China has tightened rather than loosened its environment for foreign businesses, American and European businesses in particular, inside of China. So China's rhetoric that President Xi, for example, gave in his Davos speech recently to the World Economic Forum about being the flag bearer of globalization. Well, I wish they practiced what they preach. China is hardly they're a beneficiary of globalization significantly, but they are hardly an upholder of it. This is a mercantilist trading power that has numerous restrictions. Here we are in 2017, 16 years or so after they've joined the WTO. This is a very constricted operating environment for multinationals in China. So for U.S.-China relations, that means that the kind of ballast of the pro-engagement faction, which has been the Fortune 500 companies and the big American corporate presence in China, has become increasingly alienated. You add to that the deteriorating human rights and political environment in China. We have the worst repression in China today that we've had since 1989 in the post-Tiananmen period. Civil society, NGOs, academics, intellectuals, media, social media. This is terrible. So that community has always been opposed to China, but is now even more so. Then you have the strategic studies and security community, which are increasingly concerned not just about China's island building in the South China Sea, but the Navy, the Air Force, the ballistic missiles, the intercontinental missiles, cyber. So
anti-satellite as well?
Anti-satellite. So you marry these three communities together, strategic, economic, and you might call it, broadly speaking, the human rights community. Plus, then there's the global governance community. Now we have on issues such as North Korea. So as far as the Americans are concerned, the Chinese have been totally unhelpful. In fact, they are therefore part of the problem, not part of the solution on North Korea. They've helped on certain other things, climate change, and we have to give China credit, I think, for really stepping up its game in global governance in the last few years under Xi. That's one of the kind of good news stories. involvement in peacekeeping operations, climate change, anti-piracy, these sorts of things. But broadly speaking, the U.S.-China relationship has been progressively troubled, really for the last 8 to 10 years. So Trump inherits that, and his predispositions towards China are, as I said, to be very confrontational. Now, nobody likes to be confronted. The Chinese have a particularly low threshold for criticism and confrontation. They don't take it very well. And so we can anticipate, therefore, a lot of friction between the two sides in the coming months.
To the extent to which a reassessment was on the cards, Obama's pivot was meant to address that. Somebody like Trump would argue that talking of a pivot was all very well, but somewhere down the line, Obama and the Obama people got sidetracked by, bad relations with Russia. And to the extent to which he hopes to repair the Washington-Moscow relationship, that would free his degree of maneuver in the Asia-Pacific region. Would you go along with that? That Russia became a distraction for Obama and took the focus away from China?
No, I don't think so, actually. I think Obama himself was focused like a laser beam on Asia. And his administration, I understand the critiques about the pivot having not been fulfilled as broadly as the rhetoric may have suggested, and even being resourced. But if you look at where the U.S. relations with Asia, broadly speaking, again, that's Indo-Asia, and including South Asia, where they are today compared to when he came into office, they've never been stronger. The American presence and influence and footprint in the Asia-Pacific region, never better. So Trump can squander that. He can wreck it. He inherits a very strong basis. So I don't agree with the distraction thesis, actually. Again, Obama could have done more in the Asia-Pacific region, but I don't think the Russia relationship was that distracting for him.
And the demand that Australia, ROK, Japan play more of a role, one could argue would help the US. Of course, it would also upend things in very unpredictable ways, particularly if Japan and ROK militarize in the way that Trump envisages.
Well, Trump does envisage reinvesting in the American military. He has a very disparaging view of the American military that's not shared by the American military, I can tell you, much less the national security establishment. Sort of similar to his view of the American intelligence community, which is hardly...
Which he now denies having.
On Monday and Wednesday he says one thing, Tuesday, Thursday another. Anyway, his rhetoric about the American military is very disturbing. But he claims he wants to increase the Navy by 100 ships, for example, up to 350 ships. So we're going to see a strengthened, and I think the Secretary of Defense, Mattis, has already suggested this, a strengthened American military footprint in this part of the world. That means strengthened U.S.-Indian security ties, U.S.-Australian, U.S.-Japan, and South Korea is always there, and is important. The North Korea threat is the most pressing threat in the world today. So I would anticipate that's where I see continuity in America's relations in Asia under Trump. The discontinuity I anticipate is going to be with China, and then the question is the collateral impact on other countries in the region, because they don't want to be forced to choose. Many of them value their relationships with China, and so it's going to put them in a very difficult position. Some, I suspect, Japan, Australia, I don't know about India, Vietnam, and Singapore, these countries are very close to the U.S. in national security terms, and I would anticipate and hope that that will continue.
You must have seen the op-ed by Yan Shuitong in the New York Times arguing that if the U.S. is going to follow a hostile policy towards the Chinese also have options, they will double down. How significant is that? Do you think that reflects Chinese official thinking, or is it simply a trial balloon that an academic is floating?
Well, Yan Shuitong I've known for 25 years. He's been calling for China to establish its own alliances abroad, really for the last 15 years. He thinks that China needs to take a page out of the American playbook and build alliances, and he's a voice of one in China as far as I can tell. He's had no support for his position for a very long time, so he continues with this view. But more deeply, his article suggested that their American confrontation of China will benefit China in its relations, again, with third parties. Now, I've been living in Southeast Asia at the present time for about half a year. I'm based in Singapore, but traveling all over the region. So, you know, you look at countries like Thailand, for example, and we've already seen the Philippines flip-flop under Duterte. Cambodia, Laos already pretty deeply in the Chinese pocket. But Thailand is an interesting case. Here's an American ally of many decades, and the relationship goes back to 1808. But the Thais are increasingly gravitating towards China. So in that sense, Yan Tung, I think, has a point, and a valid one.
And the Indonesians wouldn't want to choose?
No.
In a way that Trump thinks would help the U.S.?
That's right. Indonesia does not want to choose. Indonesia has its own history with China. Many Southeast Asian countries actually view China very suspiciously because China has not always been a good neighbor. And then the question is, can China deliver on its promises? So China has all this financial largesse, promises of investment. In the case of Indonesia, they promised 30 billion and delivered only 9. So, and now they have this One Belt, One Road initiative. So we're going to have to see if in fact China can take advantage of if there is a vacuum that Trump is creating, can China actually step into and effectively take advantage of it? I'm not convinced that they have the wherewithal to do so.
The Trump policy comes at a time when the Indian government has also, in a way, played its hand, or is increasingly playing its hand on China, particularly the One Belt, One Road, which you mentioned, something that we'd been silent about for 2 or 3 years, and now the Prime Minister has questioned aspects of it. Of course, within the context of the China-Pakistan economic corridor, which runs through Indian occupied territory. But there is a sense in which the establishment in India, and quite a few analysts, view with suspicion the Belt Road Initiative. They see this as something which is unilateral, something that the Chinese are laying down, which the Chinese will primarily benefit, which may encircle India. Do you think Indian fears are justified vis-a-vis the Belt Road Initiative, leaving aside the Pakistan element for the moment? Or do you think BRI is something that India ought to engage with?
No, I think Indian fears or skepticism about the Belt and Road Initiative are justified. In fact, this is not just an economic initiative, this is a geopolitical initiative. You may recall the string of pearls metaphor that people used a few years ago that the Chinese were building, in essence, a series of naval installations.
But that turned out to be overblown, those fears in a way.
But if you look at the access arrangements they have with Bangladesh, or did have with Sri Lanka, may have again with Sri Lanka, do have with Pakistan, their increasing naval and submarine presence in the Indian Ocean, I'm not sure that those fears were overblown. So I'm just pointing out that Belt and Road has a geostrategic dimension to it that I think India is quite rightly should be concerned about. On the other hand, it's an economic and an infrastructure initiative, and countries need infrastructure, India included. The United States needs infrastructure.
And all of India's neighbors are very enthusiastic about it, not just Pakistan.
Exactly. So there are tangible infrastructure benefits to be had, but then thirdly, there's Chinese corporate interests. So following the infrastructure will come a tsunami of Chinese corporate investment. And these countries are going to wake up one morning and find themselves suffocated economically and in China's embrace, and they won't be able to get out of China's embrace. This was Myanmar's experience. And to a certain extent, we're seeing that already in Thailand and in Cambodia. I was in Bangkok last week, and a senior official told me that we cannot get out of China's embrace, was the term he used, but we have to learn how to engage without being suffocated. Right. So, you know, this Belt and Road, the Chinese have a way of being too forceful in the way they implement some of these initiatives.
We're almost out of time, but in the minute I have, I wanted to ask you whether Tibet would also figure in Trump's menu of options, or is that a card which whose sell-by date or use-by date has long expired?
Oh, I don't think Trump, as far as I know, has a view about the Tibetan situation. So I don't think that's really a card. But if he wanted to poke China yet with from one more direction, I suppose that would be a direction. He's already poked them from the Taiwan direction. He will, we anticipate, poke on the economic and the security side. You know, that's enough. He's going to aggravate Chinese sensitivities even without a Tibet.
Every which way, we're entering a period of uncertainty. Thank you so much for helping us navigate some of the possibilities that a Trump presidency would have for the Asia-Pacific region, Professor Shambaugh.
My great pleasure. Thanks for inviting me.
Thank you. Well, that wraps up this episode of Indian Standard Time. Thank you for watching, and do join us again next week when we will have another guest.